Hello, friends, and thank you for joining me for another short talk. Let's talk Torah. Friends, I've been watching a lot of these Ger teachers online from the Neo-Ger movement. What's the Neo-Ger movement? Well, it's the Ger Toshav movement, the movement of resident aliens. Whoever would have thought that'd be a movement of people who just happen to reside in biblical Israel, or at least that's what it was. Friends, let me try to quickly expose the nonsense today known as Ger. Not what people call Ger Tzedek, because that just means someone who unites himself to Israel. Someone who legally immigrates or converts into the nation of Israel. But rather, the Ger Toshav movement, to some extent known as the Noahide movement, or how I like to call it, Karaite Noahidism. Now, we're still dealing with religion here. In our religion, Judaism comes from Torah. Again, our religion comes from Torah. That means anything regarding how one practices his religion, or how does one actually properly serve the God of Israel, has to also stem from Torah, or even be sanctioned by Torah. So, what is a Ger, or what the rabbis called a Ger Toshav? Friends, the Almighty brought Israel, the Hebrews, and the mixed multitude out of Egypt with a strong hand. But even the text tells us that not every Hebrew got out. In other words, the Hebrews, although their initial redemption from Egypt was secured as the promise because of what's called Zchut Avot, the merit of our forefathers, the merit of Avraham Avinu, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, they still had to choose. They had to choose, just like our father Abraham did, to go from where they were to where God ultimately wanted them and anyone who wants to walk in his ways to be. In other words, they chose God in Egypt, and they walked out behind God's messenger, Moses. Now, while the mixed multitude and the Hebrews were in the wilderness, they were being trained, they were being prepped on how to behave when they enter the promised land. And in one of those areas of instruction dealt with the future possibility of resident aliens. In other words, we know that God doesn't thrust his law on anyone, but rather to be considered part of his flock, part of his people, one had to accept the entirety of Torah upon oneself, and thus enter a covenant with God, an agreement that we would be his people and he would be our God. Two notions accompanied by a set of moral guidelines, instructions for living, which we call Torah. Okay? Clear so far? Now, one thing you will discover when learning the Hebrew language is that many times the Torah will use one word to describe more than one thing, which is why when something like this arises, we have to look at the whole section in context to see who and what is it actually referring to. And that's true with the word Ger. So the word Ger literally means stranger, alien, an outsider. Someone not either initially in the group or someone who technically never becomes part of that group. Which is why sometimes the word Ger in Torah means someone who has attached himself fully to the Jewish people, i.e. someone who shares the same law with the Jew or someone in the covenant, and someone who's just an outsider. For example, in that portion where it says, Hager lo toneh, that a ger you shouldn't mistreat. Why? Because you were also gerim in Mitzrayim. You were also strangers in Egypt. Rashi says that doesn't only mean convert or ger toshav, but anyone from the outside, whether it's a born Jew who was living in Bavel in Babylon and decided to return to Eretz Yisrael, or even a convert that in many times, especially in Rabbinic Judaism, never fully loses the stigma of being a convert, as well as possibly also referring to a resident alien. In other words, when the Torah tells us not to mistreat a ger, it's reiterating the notion that appears in Sefer Bereshit of how Avraham Avinu went out of his way to welcome in strangers, to treat them like royalty, no matter who they were. Now, how does this new ger movement tie into this? Well, simply because they've taken the identity of the ger that's not in the covenant, the resident alien, for all intents and purposes, a nomadic Canaanite, just dwelling in the region, who either wants to live or traverse through Jewish lands, and is clearly not held to the standard that the Jew who accepted Torah is held to, because he accepted nothing. Now, it's true. They exist in the story, but not in any covenant. For all intents and purposes, Ger Toshav just means docile Gentile. Now, fast forward to where we are today. Friends, this new Noahide or Ger movement claims not only to derive from this docile Gentile in Torah, but further claims that someone who wants to follow and worship the God of Israel, i.e. perform his service, just like gods in the ancient worlds, the way you worship them, the way you serve them, is through behavior. Every god demanded that you do something to constitute worship. Our God demands that we follow Torah. So this group teaches that because this group existed in Torah times, someone could identify with this group, dwell amongst Israel, and in some way claim to have a sanctified existence, a religiously validated existence in the Judaic monotheistic world of today. For example, they teach that this docile Gentile that is mentioned in Torah, honestly, none of them ever actually appeared, because when Israel was being instructed about their existence, there weren't any Gerim Toshavim yet. They haven't entered the land. They teach that if these individuals commit themselves to live by at least 7 laws, that they would be considered righteous enough to not just be validated by God, but to hold a place in the world to come. While Israel, in order for them to be considered righteous, they have to try to keep all of God's commandments, not just 7. Now let's stop here for a second. If you knew nothing else about a movement, but only that it claims that God considers them righteous, I know we say these words, and many times we lose what they actually mean. In Hebrew, a tzaddik. Honestly, friends, if it just takes 7 laws to be considered righteous in this world, then righteousness doesn't mean anything, especially when these laws do not contain fighting evil, taking care of the needy, honoring your parents, caring for the widow, the orphan, the stranger. Friends, I could go on and on. Again, if you knew nothing about this movement, you would think it's ridiculous. So how does this movement continue to exist? Easy. Because of ambiguity. In other words, because first, the Torah never mentions 7 laws. The Torah never mentions some covenant with these individuals. The Torah never mentions the notion of laws given to Noah as some standard for humanity, nor does it ever mention some covenant with Noah, outside of the rainbow covenant that the Torah states was that he would not destroy the world again with water. So, where does this come from? Friends, after Israel entered the land, the Sanhedrin, the elders, the judges, they had to come up with some standard that they would adjudicate non-Israelites by. In other words, why would they adjudicate someone of the nations who never accepted Torah upon themselves, who probably didn't even believe in the God of Israel, by Torah standards? Why would they adjudicate them against the 613 commandments that they did not accept? So the court developed 7 laws that Gentiles, either living in or traversing through Israel, had to keep. Nothing religious or spiritual attached to them. Now, like anything legal in the Jewish world, folklore and legend crept in and introduced the idea that these laws existed all the way going back to Adam. That God gave Adam 6 laws, and he gave the final law to Noah, as to in some way fill in all the gray area in Torah of how God adjudicated humanity before Torah was given. This, when you study rabbinic literature, you will find a lot of. It's called Agadah, Midrashei Agadah. Later on, it's called Midrash, folklore and legend. There's tons of it, and it almost always, by definition, contradicts itself. But that aside, it's man-made legend. Not in Torah, not given on Mount Sinai, man-made. Now, does that mean it's completely disposable? Absolutely not. Because we see that this is the vehicle that our sages used many times to teach prescriptive topics in rabbinic literature. They would teach with story, but one was always required to make a distinction between the law, the story, and Torah, the source material. Now, as a matter of fact, there's only about 2 places that the legends teach that there were 7 laws. There's another rabbi who said there were 30 laws. There was another rabbi who said there were 3 laws. There was another rabbi who said there were 10 laws. And yet another rabbi who said that if these people wanted to dwell amongst Israel, they had to keep all the commandments. Now, there were also rabbis who taught that although they had to keep these commandments on threat of death, because that was universally understood, that if a Gentile broke any one of these supposed 7 laws, they were liable for decapitation, about half of all the rabbis in the Talmud taught that they got no reward in some afterlife for keeping these commands. However, some said they did. Not specifically the 7 laws, but if they were righteous. A very ambiguous term when dealing with Gentiles, because this is not set in stone. Now we leave the world of Tanaim and Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmud. Move in the Rishonim, rabbis of the medieval era. And the most famous of these rabbis was the Rambam, Maimonides. Now Maimonides, as with many other topics, he codified the notion of a Ger Toshav, aka Noahide, which is why he is the teacher people quote the most regarding the 7 laws of Noah. He held by the opinion that it was 7 laws, although in other areas he brings in extra laws like the prohibition of grafting, making it more than 7, but at least according to the Rambam, always 7 when it came to the death penalty. So the Rambam was of the opinion that if a Gentile kept these 7 laws, because they came to him through our tradition, that he was secured a place in the world to come. Again, this is just the Rambam's opinion, because elsewhere he writes that when a Gentile comes to convert, in order to encourage him to convert, we tell him that only Israel, only those who attach themselves to Israel get a share in the world to come, properly acknowledging that as a codifier, his job was just to reiterate the opinions in the Talmud, opinions that didn't always line up. Now, till the time of the Rambam, there was never a Ger Toshav or a Noahide that ever existed in Jewish history at all. The closest thing that existed was the notion of the God-fearers. Now, the God-fearers were Gentiles during the time of the Second Temple, predominantly men who kept all of Torah, but did not go through a formal circumcision to officially enter the Jewish people. For whatever reason, political, social, they were Gentiles who feared God. But nowhere does it ever identify them with a Ger Toshav, or one of the righteous of the nations. Now, fast forward to the 1960s. During the 1960s, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe started a campaign to encourage Gentiles to consider living by 7 laws. Now, at the time, this was a very controversial campaign. Why? Because students of Halakha knew that the understanding as brought down by the Rambam was that a Ger Toshav could only be made when Israel was back in the land keeping the Jubilee. In other words, the Messianic age. Now Chabad, who the Rebbe was the head of, was knee-deep in Messianic fervor, even till today, believing that they were in the Messianic age. And one of the missing components, apart from bringing all the Jews back into the fold, fighting the wars of the Lord, and building the temple, was introducing the role of the Noahide or Ger Toshav. They made it popular. However, neither I nor any other competent rabbi would ever say that the Noahide movement that the Lubavitcher Rebbe spearheaded in any way resembled the Ger Toshav movement of today. Why? Because, respectfully so, they knew that there just wasn't enough material, coherent, authoritative material, to offer the Noahide movement to Gentiles as an alternative to becoming a full Jew. Compare that to how it's taught nowadays. How they not only just offer Noahidism, or the status of a Ger Toshav, to someone who already wants to convert to Judaism, someone who has already taken upon themselves all of God's commandments, but go further and teach that someone who keeps 613 commandments is not in any way greater than someone who commits to only keep 7. In other words, it has become what it wasn't allowed to become. like the Rambam said, a new religion, because it's not in Torah as a viable alternative to entering God's covenant and keeping his laws. In other words, in Torah, God only gave one standard. Again, in Torah, God only gave one standard, and he makes no distinction between those laws. He never says these laws are for Gentiles and these laws are for people who want to accept my covenant. As a matter of fact, he goes further. He tells both the Hebrews and the mixed multitude on Har Sinai to choose life, to choose Torah that they should live. One can only imagine how Har Sinai would have looked like if there were Noahides back then. They'd be amongst the Hebrews, telling the Hebrews, don't accept Torah. Don't enter into some covenant. You don't have to. Just keep 7 laws and you'll be special to God. And further, you'll get a place in the world to come. I guess the Hebrews shouldn't have accepted Torah. Are you beginning to see how silly this is? Another reason why we know that this not only didn't exist in Jewish history, but had no reason to, is because according to Jewish law, conversion took a day or two. That's the halakha. Now, if conversion took a day or two, why would anyone choose some sort of second-class status instead of being counted as a full Jew if he truly believed in Torah and the God of Israel? No, friends, the problem is that conversion nowadays has become politicized and takes years, if it's even possible in most places. So the question arose, what do we call all these individuals who want to convert but can't? Well, let's call them Noahides and use their existence to fund projects we have towards the Jewish people. And that gave birth to the Noahide movement of our generation. But one of the most important points that I cannot reiterate enough is that Agadot, Midrashim, anything written in rabbinic literature about these Noahide laws are man-made. They're man-made. They're the opinions of our sages. And we know that the Almighty only gave the authority to the elders to rule on legal matters, not on metaphysical matters, on whether who gets a place in the world to come or who doesn't. No, but to rule on halakha. All these other things are optional to believe. But it seems that no one bothered to tell this to the architects of this new Ger movement, because you'll find many videos online made by their teachers trying to compose a theological puzzle with every ambiguous statement that appears in the Talmud regarding the Ger Toshav and Gentiles. And instead of saying, like rabbis always have, that such legends exist independent of others, they lump them all in together to try to paint one picture of how the person of the Ger Toshav could exist today. For example, they'll take the fact that around 5 rabbis in the Talmud mentioned an idea regarding a Ger Toshav that completely disagreed with another idea, and they'll say that this is one type of Ger Toshav and that is another type of Ger Toshav. In other words, they'll continue building instead of saying that it's only a disagreement, trying to find something, anything, to further continue building this new religion, which is why it is no secret that the sources used predominantly by the Ger Toshav movement to justify their existence are Kabbalistic sources, sources outside the Talmud, that keep propelling and solidifying the existence of the Ger Toshav of today. In other words, we're way past what just appears in Torah, or even the ambiguous statements in the Talmud. No, friends, what's employed now is a sea of esoteric Kabbalistic literature that paints a monstrosity of a theology. So what am I trying to tell you? Friends, if you're serious about keeping Torah and walking in the ways of God, your base has to be the 5 books of Moses. Heck, that's the basis for every Torah Jew. And in those books, our Creator only gave one standard, one opportunity to commune with Him, and that's by entering the Torah covenant. And it's Torah itself that sanctions the existence of what we consider Torah Shebaal Peh. Torah Shebaal Peh are the rulings of the court as it appears in Deuteronomy chapter 17. We have a command to listen to the rulings of the judges. Not anything esoteric, metaphysical, just law. And that's what makes up Judaism. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and what's called halakha, Everything else, folklore and legend, esoteric stories, Kabbalistic literature, is optional to believe and not sturdy enough to be offered as some alternative to full Torah Judaism. And I know that many of you listening to me tonight have come from Christian backgrounds. I want you to look back to when you were a Christian and acknowledge how far you went to keep the Torah's integrity and dignity intact, not tolerating anyone adding to God's holy message. And fast forward to where you are today, completely abandoning the unchangeable message in Torah, stating that God has given us another option in order to find favor with Him. Similarly to what your old religion taught, that JC was also another option that didn't appear in Torah. Friends, there's only one option, and that's to enter the Torah covenant through a formal conversion process. That's it, and that's all. Friends, if you're serious about Torah, become Jewish. Now you're probably thinking, what if I cannot go through a formal conversion process because I don't live in a Jewish neighborhood? Well then, friends, keep Torah to the best of your ability and accept Torah, just like the Hebrews and the mixed multitude accepted Torah on Mount Sinai. That's it. You can enter the covenant like that. You won't be accepted as part of Israel, but God will accept you as part of His people. And stop calling yourself a Noahide or a Ger Toshav, and just say that I'm in transition, I'm converting. No matter how long that will take you, live by Torah and still reap the rewards for keeping Torah. Friends, if you need more information on this topic or anything regarding Judaism, please visit TorahJudaism.com. Thank you.